Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful, and may He send His prayers upon Muhammad, His final messenger, and his household and companions. How can anyone deny Allah, God, the creator of heaven and earth? How can anyone deny Him when His signs are everywhere around us? Still, many people do deny Allah and claim that there is no evidence for Allah. Many of us Muslims feel obliged to respond to these false claims, but we should know that we cannot do so adequately without knowledge. It is also important to realize that Allah creates people different. Allah says that He creates people, some of them are unbelievers while some are believers. He also says that He elevates people with knowledge, and that the closest of us to Allah are those with greater piety. And we Muslims cannot force anyone to change his mind. It is Allah who guides whomever He wills. The hearts are between two fingers of Allah. He turns them as He wills. What we can do is remind the people of the evidence and call them to Allah with knowledge. It is also important to realize that the arguments in the Quran and the Sunnah are very sufficient. My Muslim brothers and sisters, Allah explains the many signs of His Lordship and oneness. The evidence is already there in the Quran, but we have to be willing to think and understand it. There are many things, however, that may influence us to the extent that we may no longer understand these verses and these signs. But the more we think about the Quran and the more we ask Allah sincerely for help, the closer will Allah's mercy be to us, and the closer will we be to understanding these verses. We Muslims should not invent new arguments. This is not only a waste of our time, but it is also very dangerous, and it causes much confusion. Let me give you a small example. Most of us have heard the claims of scientific miracles. We must have heard at one point or another this widespread argument, which goes like this: scientific facts exist in the Quran, and the Prophet ﷺ could never have known them on his own, and that therefore the Quran is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And many Muslims use this invention to defend Islam. They use it to defend their belief in Allah. Unfortunately, the Prophet never used it. And so why should we depend on an argument which the Prophet never used? Many times these inventions distract us from the correct proofs which Allah mentions in the Quran. And many times people depend on these inventions very heavily. And this is a very big problem. And so this brings us to another question. How do we know Allah, and how do we respond to atheists and non-Muslims when they ask us about Allah? We should do this by the Quranic method, and it is to remind them of the signs of Allah and His blessings. Allah mentions many signs in His book. He mentions the sun and the moon and the night and the day. He mentions the seas and the trees, the animals, the rain, the mountains. He mentions the fruits. He mentions our sight, our hearing. And these are all signs of Allah glorified and exalted. Now atheists may laugh at this, my Muslim brothers and sisters. This is only because they are ignorant, not because of any deficiency in the arguments of the Quran and the Sunnah. In fact, Allah reveals the most powerful rational proofs. And I draw your attention to 3 of the great signs of Allah He mentions in the Quran. And not only does Allah mention these signs, He also explains the ways in which they indicate His divine majesty and His qualities. Allah says that indeed in the creation of the heavens and the earth and the alternation of the night and the day are signs for those of understanding. And we all know that the sun rises and sets, and that this motion causes an alternation of night and day. Allah mentions the wisdom in doing this. He says, out of His mercy He made for you the night and the day, that you may rest therein, and by day seek from His bounty, and that perhaps you will be grateful. And just before that, Allah mentions that He could have made the night and the day very long, such that we no longer find them useful for our existence. The second sign is the moon. Allah mentions that He made the moon a light, and He also mentions the purpose for which He made it with phases. Allah says that He determined for its phases that you may know the number of years and account of time. In other words, the moon is a convenient calendar which helps people easily calculate time. And if Allah helps us to know time, He will also help us to know our direction. This brings us to the third sign of Allah, which is the stars. And not only does Allah adorn the sky with these stars, but He also makes them very useful to us. Our grandfathers, we tend to forget, would never have been able to travel at night or cross the seas without watching these stars. And people still use these stars in navigation. They still use them to navigate their ships today. And this is a sign of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is a sign of His care and mercy. Allah says, "It is He who placed for you the stars, that you may be guided by them through the darknesses of the land and sea. We have detailed the signs for a people who know." And the signs of Allah are many, and there are many ways to this process of reflection in God's signs. Allah's creation is not just useful and functional, it is also many times very beautiful. And I note that it is especially useful to think about these signs in the light of the revealed verses. Let me close with this thought. The scholar Ibn Taymiyyah mentions a small example of how our bodies indicate Allah's wisdom. He mentions that the water in our eyes is made salty to protect the eye and preserve it, and that the water in our ears is bitter to keep insects away, and that our saliva is pleasant and convenient. Now imagine your ears were sweet. Imagine that your eyes were sour, and that your saliva was bitter. You see, this is a clear indication of Allah's wisdom. Wisdom, by definition, is to put everything in its correct and suitable place. And the more we ponder these signs, the more we understand, the more we know Allah, His wisdom and His qualities.